Good morning, Mr. O.C. here. Came to talk about the operation of the table saw. What is a table saw? That's basically a saw for ripping material to width. If you look at the saw, you can see that there's a saw blade mounted permanently in the saw. And this one you move the wood to the blade. A lot of saws you move the blade to the wood, but this one is stationary. Primarily used for ripping wood to width. You can do cross cutting on here. Of course, reminder is ripping is cutting it down the center with the grain. You can kind of see the lines here. Cross cutting is going across the grain or sideways. When you're ripping, you need to always use the fence. This is called a rip fence. The way it works is your board slides up against the fence. You need to figure out what measurement you need. So if I want a board that's 3 inches wide, I'm going to set it up here. I'm going to measure 3 inches. Lock it in place. When I'm measuring to the inside of the blade, because my blade thickness is 1/8 of an inch wide. So I want to make sure the piece I'm keeping is not 1/8 inch short, so I'm measuring to the inside of the saw blade. Once I have it set, I'm ready to go. I have my guard down. Of course, you need safety glasses on. One thing is state law, but number two is most important, is just protect your eyes. And I've had a lot of people say, oh, my dad's worked construction for years, doesn't ever wear glasses. Well, that's true, and may get away with it, but to me it's like wearing my seatbelt. I haven't had a wreck. I'm 54 years old, never had a car accident, luckily. But I still wear my seatbelt every day just because I'm not going to take that chance. So safety glasses on. If you wear prescription glasses, you can wear face shield or goggles, or most prescription glasses are rated for safety rating. Of course, we'll turn the saw on. You'll let it reach full speed when you start. You'll hear it start here in a second. I use my push stick, so I'm going to lay it here. I'm going to make my cut. Turn the saw off. And pretty quickly you can see I'm getting board cut to the width I need. Scrap piece, you notice I waited until the blade was stopped before I reach in to get it. A couple of things you may or may not have noticed when I was cutting is I used these little things here, they call them push sticks, basically because you're pushing the wood through the blade with the saw blade. Main purpose of that is just get space between my fingers and the saw blade. That way if something happens, board kicks back, then I've got reaction times and my fingers aren't good cutting as these push sticks getting cut. Kind of the design on, you see a little notch here and then two different styles. This one is used to hold the board down flat on the table and against the fence. That way it doesn't move. This one I used on the tail end to push through. Came through this way, pushed it all the way past the blade when I was finished. And that way I've got my fingers clear. Another thing you may have not noticed is when I was cutting here, I had the push stick in the center between the fence and the blade. Reason for that is it keeps it straight. If I come here and make a push, see how it stays straight when I'm pushing here? You come on the edge, naturally it wants to push the board that way, which is pushing it into the saw blade. So you want to keep it centered, help keep it straight. Some of the other things on the saw that I didn't really talk about, of course the guard I think is obvious to you, but there's little things here, it's called a splitter. What a splitter does is when the board comes past it, it separates it and kind of splits the boards away from each other. So the part that you cut isn't going back into the saw blade. And then this little piece here, you can see it's a little black piece, it's got little points on the end of it. There's one on each side, they call it anti-kickbacks. What a kickback is when the board gets caught in the blade, it's not like something that throws it backwards. They're just going through and it says, you know what, it's easier to throw it back instead of cutting it. If it gets twisted or turned, they don't happen very often, but they are possible. What the kickback does is when the board's going through it, see how it lifts up as the board goes through? But if it jerks back real fast, it catches on that kickback and stops it from coming back at you. So just a safety feature to keep you from getting hit by the board if it does kick back. Kickbacks aren't real common, like I said, maybe one every 2 years. Somebody's hurrying, not paying attention. But again, safety just to add devices into it. Also, when I was cutting, I was standing on one side. I stood like this cutting, pushed the board through. You don't want to stand behind it, because what happens if it kicks back, comes back and hits you? back in the face. You don't stand here, so you stand to one side of the saw blade. If the board is bigger than 6 inches, then you can cut without push sticks. You don't need the push sticks, you just use your hands if you're cutting a wide board. So if I had a board like this one and I just needed to trim an inch off of it, I'll move these over, keep a clean work area. I hang my push sticks back up. But if it's over 6 inches wide, then you've got reaction times, and you can do it without the push sticks. Same thing, you're going to stand on one side. Thing to watch out for is if you have a long board that you're not lifting, that you keep flat on the table on the front edge, you're not coming up this way or this way. Stays flat on the table and against the fence. So I'm going to come down here, I'm going to turn the saw on. Standing to the side, slide it through. Again, pretty quickly, it makes work of cutting it. Blade's still running, so I'm not going to reach in yet. Now it's stopped turning, so I can raise the guard up, move my scrap out if I need to. Grab the piece that I cut, and I've got it to the side and ready to go. Again, this is ripping if you're cutting it lengthwise. You can do cross-cutting on the miter saw, or the table saw. Use a miter gauge is what this is. The way it's designed is there's some little slots here, you slide it in, and I can turn the board sideways because cross-cutting is going across the grain. If I line it up here with a saw blade, I'm going to check my blade height. It should only be about 1/4 inch above the wood. So I'll lower this down just a hair. Usually about a saw tooth is what I call it. Everybody says 1/4 inch, some books say 1/2 inch. I always go the height of the saw tooth. That way it's going through. A couple reasons for that. One, if I'm cutting, some reason I slip. Worst case, I'm going to cut the bottom of my hand. I'm not going to cut my fingers clear off. This saw does have a safety feature to prevent that, which we'll talk about later. It's called a saw stop, and it's got a safety system that'll keep it from cutting your fingers off. So when you're cross-cutting, bring the board here. You're going to hold the miter gauge in one hand and hold the board against the miter gauge in the other hand as you're sliding. Make sure you leave a space between here, because if you bring it up solid and you cut it, what happens once this board gets cut into? It's trapped in here, right? And it's going to vibrate and twist, and that's what's going to cause it to kick back. So make sure you have a space in here. Cross-cutting, same thing. Turn the saw on, hold it here and here, and just come across. Turn the saw off. Let the blade come to a stop before I reach in. And then you can take your scrap piece and you've got your good piece. So what if I needed, say, I don't know, 4 pieces exact same length I want to cross cut? You can use the fence and miter gauge as long as you put a spacer block in there. Spacer block is anything you put in there between the two. So I can use this block of wood, I can clamp it to the fence. And now if I want them the same, I can come up here, cut it. When I do that, there'll be a space in there, so if it does vibrate, it's going to be easier for it to push it to that space than it is to kick it back. So I can turn this on, turn this on, make my cut, slide over to my stop block again, slide it back, turn it off. Again, waiting for the blade to stop. Students like to reach in and grab it before the blade stops turning. And real quickly, I got 2 pieces of exact same height just by using a spacer block in there. You can also use a miter saw, which we'll talk about later, but if you only have a table saw, that would be the way to go for the spacer block there. So that takes care of part 1, doing the ripping and cross-cutting with the miter gauge. We'll come back and start part 2 here in a second.